The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Economic Impacts of Data Centers. This webinar is being presented by Dr. Alex Gebben and Bailey Henry Kirkland from the Center of Business and Economic Analysis at the University of Wyoming. At REMI, our mission is to inform public policy. For over 40 years now, we have provided software that allows government and non-government decision makers to test the economic effects of their policies before they're implemented. We work in the fields of economic development, taxation, transportation, energy and environment, and much more. Um, I encourage you, if you have any questions about REMI specifically, to please ask those questions. A couple members of the REMI team are here during this presentation to answer those questions. I also, if there's any questions about the content of today's webinar, please ask those into the question box. Time permitting, we will moderate these questions to our presenters, but if there's any we do not get to, we'll be sure to reach out to you individually. So feel free to keep them coming. I want to mention that shortly after the presentation concludes, you'll be receiving a copy of the slides and a recording. Feel free to reach out to us on the info at the emails that will be displayed at the end if you have any questions once you review those materials. And finally, I want to let everyone know about a cool new feature of GoToWebinar that allows you to zoom into the screen during the presentation. So if there's any charts or graphs or things that you're having trouble seeing, I hope you find that to be a useful feature. And that's enough for me for now. I'm now going to pass it along to David Ingram, a senior associate at REMI, who will introduce our two speakers.
Thank you very much, Brian. And yes, thank you everybody for attending. Welcome to this presentation on the economic impact of data centers. I'm the representative for REMI during this call. My name is David Ingram, a senior associate. I have the great privilege of introducing our speakers today. Quick bio about Dr. Alexander Gebben. Alex is an energy economist conducting research with the Center for Business and Economic Analysis. He comes from the Colorado School of Mines, holds a PhD and MSc in mineral and energy economics, as well as a BSc in petroleum engineering. This background has led him to diverse research topics in the areas of nuclear energy, groundwater management, oil industry incentives, and unconventional methods of lithium recovery. He is particularly interested in how these industries are responsive to policy, natural resources, and economic outcomes. Before joining the CBEA, he conducted research projects in conjunction with the Critical Materials Institute, as well as the USDA. Our second speaker today, also an economist from the University of Wyoming, is Bailey Henry Kirkland. Bailey is a research economist at the Center for Business and Economic Analysis. He earned his MS in economics from the University of Wyoming, where he is also pursuing his PhD in economics. His research primarily focuses on wildlife management, tourism, human responses to natural disasters, air pollution, and health economics. Bailey is especially interested in the sustainability of Wyoming's resource management and tourism in the face of changing political and climatic conditions. Before joining the CBEA, he worked as an economist with the U.S. Geological Survey. That is our introduction for our two speakers. I'll hand it right now over to Alex. Take it away.
Thank you. I'd like to start off by thanking REMI for inviting us to share some of our experience in the data center field. I think it's a growing and interesting area, so I'm excited to be able to share some of what we've been thinking about with everyone here. So a little bit about our center. We're a nonprofit portion of the University of Wyoming. We try to provide at cost economic studies for different parties in the state, whether that's corporate or government or academic. So we cover kind of a wide range of topics. So, depending on your use case, I think we have some experience we can talk about. We've done over 65 studies, primarily focusing in Wyoming, but touching in sort of different regions in the Mountain West. Particularly for this study, we've done a couple of data center impact studies for kind of wanting to know what sort of job impacts and different tax revenues might be brought in, as well as some overview studies of the area. My work, as was mentioned, is focused a lot on nuclear sector, which ends up having more overlap than you'd expect, that these things kind of tie into each other. there's been some growth in our state. We have the first advanced reactor that's going to be commercially available, has started construction, and due to that, there's been some specific interest in putting in data centers that uses the power generated in Kimmer. So these things kind of interplay, and that's one of the areas I find the most interesting is how these different sectors interplay. So if you want to know more about us, there's a link to our website. So the flow of this presentation, we're going to kind of go over some of the main background in data center, just how do we define terms and how are things going, before talking about what might be important about modeling or what are some of the different use cases. There's a lot of different applications, so we'll focus on one particular model, but you might be doing policy impact analysis. There's a lot of different things that could be at play in the future. And just from our experience, what have been some things that have come up in different projects that might be a little bit unique to the sector as a growing industry, before talking about our particular sort of toy model and what those results would tell you about the industry. So in broad strokes, I want to talk about what is a data center, because people use different terms for different things. On the left here, we have basically a home server, and on the right, there's a multi-billion-dollar project which is being developed in Utah. So both of these can be considered data centers, which is why sometimes this industry can be hard to talk about. Sort of a very technical definition would just be, it's any place where you might have computer infrastructure that's sort of housed in a central location. Obviously, the big use case, which I'm sure most people are thinking about right now, are these large language models that ChatGPT, those sorts of things that are growing in popularity and require a lot of computational power. So it's created sort of a new demand for highly efficient centralized computer systems, and data centers are growing because they provide that sort of economy of scale that you can't get if you sort of spread things out like that little home server model. But prior to that, some people were talking about sort of these proof of work mining concepts that'd be like Bitcoin, where sometimes there's different variations of that, but you sometimes want very centralized systems because you get economies of scale and cooling, and maybe you want some central housing to do that mining operation. Other use cases are cloud storage. These are not as energy intensive, which is why it's important to talk about what use case you're looking at. But people think of the cloud as sort of this magical, I just save it in the cloud, but in the back end, if you're using Outlook or some hosting service, that's being stored on a hard drive, just like it would be in your computer. So those hard drives have to be stored somewhere, and that's technically a data center. Websites often run in these because they can be kept online. You could run a website from your house, but it's sort of a lot more convenient for people if there's a dedicated 24 hours a day static IP place to operate it, virtual private networks. But there's still anything that you might want a computer system that people are connecting to, you can use a data center for. So I want to talk about sort of the broad global trends and sort of zoom in into the United States and then Wyoming. Globally, this is from the International Energy Administration. We're expecting a lot of growth in China, even in Europe, for the power use of these projects. And power is kind of a metric people like to use because it's a little more universal, although efficiency makes that a little more complicated. So you can see this overall projected energy use of data centers, they're going to double, is the kind of the expectation by 2030 globally. So that's huge. That's and we've already had them grow at a faster rate than they ever had before. So wherever you are globally, this is definitely a big player to be interested in. You probably have a lot of questions about. And another area, and this is, we talked about the large language learning models. There's a lot of uncertainty in this space. Just one reason why economists and different practitioners should be involved in giving our best estimates. There's often this trade-off in people's perspectives between how fast will these things grow? Do you expect this to be sort of more steady, that we're not going to be applying these AI technologies to more and more things? Or do you expect it to kind of dominate future productivity growth? And then on the sort of another axis, you have how efficient are things going to get? There's sort of the standard Moore's law, where you sort of get a higher efficiency in computational time that's slowed down. but there's debates about how much we expect these deployments to improve efficiency. We've seen some efficiency improvement, especially in water and energy use already. So these interplay, and you can kind of get these four scenarios where low growth, high efficiency, high growth, low efficiency would be the highest, and sort of how they interplay. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but sort of in all the scenarios, we do expect growth. So under pretty much anyone's scenarios, this is an important space to be thinking about and modeling. Looking at the US, even though we do expect some growth in the sector, it's not going to be the dominant energy consumption. This is data that was gathered from the EIA. It's their energy outlook. And this is kind of what they expect in a baseline scenario to be the consumption use of power by different sources. And I've sort of separated into data center specifics versus other categories. And while data centers are expected to grow, they're not going to be overtaking heating and cooling uses and other major dominant sources of energy. However, that doesn't mean it's not very important. So this is breaking out the same data, but looking at just the growth change. So there are a lot of trends that lead to a sort of a baseline expectation that energy consumption will actually go down in the upcoming years. This can be more high efficiency insulation in homes, more efficient technology. There's a lot of improvements in those areas, which on net, even though there's population growth, we kind of expect all else equal to have a declining strain on the grid. But when data centers come in, we actually expect more terawatt hours of demand to be implemented. So it does play a very large story in how you expect these future trends to come in the US, and is again one reason why I'm sure a lot of people are interested in doing some sort of study in the United States. So with this, I'm going to turn it to Bailey to talk a little about some Wyoming specifics.
Yeah, so trends in Wyoming largely parallel those seen throughout the rest of the US and the world in general. There's been a lot of private investment in data centers. I believe the first one was constructed in the early 2010s. And now at this point, we have 10 companies with data centers here in the state. They're all located in and around Cheyenne, our capital, in the southeast corner. And in Laramie County, where Cheyenne is located, there's 5 other data centers under construction and another 9 proposed. And throughout other parts of the state, we're starting to see some data centers being proposed and or constructed. We just saw the largest private investment in Wyoming's history over in Evanston, the southwest corner of the state, by a company called Prometheus Hyperscale. They're now expanding to make another facility in Casper. So we're seeing a lot of investment. This is a pretty booming industry by Wyoming standards. That's mainly because there's a lot of available land. We have cool climate, which keeps energy costs down low. There's been a large statewide push, both from the local and county level, but also at the state level to help to diversify Wyoming's economy. We're traditionally thought of as a energy dominant state, oil, gas, and coal. And right now, coal is forecasted to continue to decline. We're seeing coal-fired power plants shut down around the state. And so Wyoming and folks that work in economic development are looking toward, other sources of employment and growth. And that's coming in the form of things like nuclear energy and wind energy to keep us in the energy space, but also the data center industry, which is very closely tied to the energy industry as well. And with that, there's been some state level incentives to get data centers to locate here, namely the Wyoming data center sales tax exemption, which essentially if a data center invests a certain amount of money in upfront capital investment, they get sales tax exemptions on computing and server equipment. If they reach another tier of capital investment, they get sales tax exemptions on power generation, backup power generation, air filtration, and battery equipment. which are all huge inputs to production for a data center. So these are relatively large tax breaks to try to incentivize companies to come here. Now, within the data center space, both in Wyoming, but nationally and globally as well, there's a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of questions that people are working on trying to answer, ourselves included here at the CBA. And as an economist, I like to conceptualize these in terms of benefits and cost, and then some related policy questions that weigh benefits versus cost. A lot of the benefits concern typical measurements of economic development or economic impact in terms of value added, jobs, output, labor income, things like that, metrics like that. These data centers lead to huge upfront capital investments. In our case here in Wyoming, we're seeing investments exceeding multi-billion dollars. These large upfront capital investments are mainly coming to construct the facilities themselves, either being the data center or some in-house power generation capacity as well. This leads to large influxes in construction employment, up to thousands of employees at any given time. And of course, it leads to operational employment over a longer time horizon as well. People that actually run the data centers and run the power generation units. Typically, these data centers support wages that are higher than median wages that we're seeing in and around Wyoming communities. It leads to fiscal revenue for the state, injections of fiscal revenue that then supports public good provision. Of course, in terms of economic impacts, we typically think of them as also inclusive of what we talk about as indirect and induced effects. Those in this webinar that work in the economic development space are probably familiar with it, but for those that are not, indirect effects are essentially economic activity that's supported through intermediate inputs to production. So if a data center goes out and buys computing equipment, somebody's got to make that computing equipment, and so it leads to jobs in the computing manufacturing industry alongside value added and labor income, et cetera. The computing industry then goes on to purchase its inputs from, say, the chips industry and down the line. Induced effects pertain to economic activity generated from employee compensation or proprietary income. So if I'm a technician for a data center, I get paid a salary. I go out into my local community where I live and I buy groceries, I pay rent, I may buy a car from a local dealership. And so what people are trying to do is to quantify the total impact, which is the combination of the direct impact, the indirect and induced impacts. Of course, there's some other impacts that are a little harder to talk about, such as productivity gains for co-located firms. So if we introduce a data center to an area, you might have other tech firms coming and increasingly incentivized to locate near those data centers. Same with wage spillovers to surrounding markets in which data center wages being elevated may lead to increased wages across other industries. Of course, we're economists. We can't talk about the benefits without talking about the cost. And these costs are typically what you're seeing in reported in the news these days, both on a local scale, a state scale, and a federal, and maybe even global scale. One of the big concerns surrounds energy consumption. These data centers demand a lot of energy. And if they're connected to the grid, they compete and they could drive up prices for residential consumers and other businesses as well. And so this is an often repeated concern in this space. This energy demand can also lead to sort of more volatile electricity provision. And then related to pricing, since these data centers demand so much energy for cooling and computing and et cetera, utilities companies typically have to expand to their infrastructure, and that costs money, and residences are concerned that those costs are going to be reflected in their household electricity bills. There's also concerns about water consumption. Originally, these data centers and related power generation used evaporative cooling as a means to cool all of their machinery. But more recently, they're leaning toward and they're moving toward closed loop cooling systems, which consume a lot less water. So this is appearing to be slightly less of an issue going forward than it originally was when these data centers were first being talked about. But this is still a really relevant concern for a lot of communities, especially here in the American West, where we have worsening drought conditions. Climate science suggests that these drought conditions will worsen and further strain water availability throughout the West, especially states that depend on the Colorado River Basin, like us here in Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and especially California. Land use pressure is another big one. Of course, you know, if you locate a data center in a given area, you can't use it for alternative uses. Workforce housing has strained some communities. Like I mentioned, construction of these facilities can lead to injections of, you know, 2 or 3 or maybe even higher thousand construction workers at any given time, which a lot of data centers and local communities are building what they call man camps, so really temporary housing to support these people. But if these man camps don't exist, it can lead to increases in housing costs for people that live in the area due to, you know, additional housing demand. In some cases, some of these small towns in Wyoming, the construction workforce could very well double the population in a town for a couple of years. And so that's extremely hard to accommodate. So a lot of communities are grappling with that. Same with light and noise pollution. These are classic environmental externalities. These data centers typically have lights on them that may lead to light pollution, may obscure nighttime skies, things like that. And then they also generate a lot of noise. I say generate a lot of noise. They can generate some noise, mainly through their backup power generators. And this bothers people that live in and around the area. It could have effects on their home prices and things like that. And then lastly, there's some larger concerns that are associated with data centers, generally around the expansion of AI, namely AI's effect on unemployment into the future due to automation of certain industries, and then general concerns around income inequality, large tech firms moving into an area, perhaps reaping a lot of a lot of economic benefits, whereas local communities may perceive that those benefits are not going to stay. So you'll see a lot of news articles in the space. Some states have debated moratoriums on data center development. I think 16 states up to this point have considered legislation. Only one state has proceeded in the first round of signing of the bill to make it through the legislative process, and that's New York State. Cheyenne and Wyoming considered a 1-year moratorium, but it was shut down. So there's been pushback. People recognize that there's some benefits. People also recognize there's some cost, and some people are sounding some alarm bells that maybe some of this development needs to slow down so that we can learn to mitigate some of these costs and better understand these costs. From a policy perspective, of course, once you understand benefits and costs, there's all sorts of policy-related questions you could ask, such as, should we extend our tax exemptions for data centers here in Wyoming? Of course, when we have tax exemptions, that incentivizes companies to locate here in the state, but we also forego some revenue, but then we gain some revenue from having a new data center in the state. So you could do some fiscal policy analysis in that regard. Of course, you could assess zoning policy, what would be the impacts of creating data center zoning laws that may mitigate some of the noise and light pollution related externalities by locating data centers further from residences. Of course, there's all of the housing questions. How do you deal with a short-term, very strong increase in housing demand in a given area, especially for a place in which you'd see, you know, maybe a doubling of the population for a couple of years? How do you deal with that? Both working with the data center to provide the housing, but maybe there's some other government-related policy that could affect housing supply in a general area. Back to you, Alex.
So given that these questions are so important to be looking at, kind of want to look at what are some of the particular challenges you might face in the sector. So, well, I guess in a broad perspective, I think one thing I want to highlight is, in your case, there's probably going to be a lot of specifics. So if you're looking at a specific project versus sort of overall trends, you really need to manage that. And one of those important things is your facility using on-site power, or are they tapping into the grid? You know, when people are concerned about the effect on the electricity grid, that really does matter on, are you self-generating or not? A lot of the projects we've worked with, because they are so large, end up building their own facility on site. So they're not directly impacting, they might even, in some extent, be enhancing the grid, because there might be a little bit excess capacity if there were blackouts or something, if they end up deciding to hooking on. So when you're modeling, it's like, you need to look at, are you actually on site, or should you be using these modeling things that RIMI gives, where you kind of have the long-term spillover in electricity demand. And that source of power matters a lot too. So talking about the water use, people certainly might be thinking about, do they have a closed cooling system? How are they cooling their computers? And that their particular design does affect the water use, which has been declining with time typically. But a big one is, what power source they're tapping into. So if you're using a gas turbine that is not using water as a cooling system, you're not actually going to be using that much water. Where if you're tapping into the grid and you're using a coal system that uses water to cool it, you're actually having this sort of induced downstream water use. So it may not be obvious, but if you're concerned about water, you should really model what type of power source they're doing. And RIMI lets us sort of model demand impacts and make custom industries. So there's different ways to model that. The tools overall is like, how is it having that feedback into the demand system, which RIMI does a great job of typically, but we're talking about, you really need a tool that's not just accounting for that specific impact, but also seeing how those feedbacks work. A challenge you'll probably come across that I have had is there's sort of a delay in industry data. You use the best practices, but I talked about, a call center might be categorized in the same NAICS code as these large data centers, and their power consumption are very different. So the way things worked out in our model, we didn't need to make much adjustment to the custom industry, but you might want to consider making a custom data center industry based on your best forecasts of how their different demand sources come in. They're going to purchase different types of equipment depending on what type of data center they are. And sort of along with that, the industry is changing quite rapidly. So one of the things that I really liked when I was using RIMI is that they actually have some coherent constraints on long-term economic forecast for these growing industries. So I'm actually sort of doing these macro constraints that, as an economist, know are a little bit more feasible than if I just assume that they're going to grow at the same rate they are now, which is not feasible. There's going to be some sort of smoothing out. So thinking about when you're modeling it, are you accounting for those sort of long-term growth that you expect in emerging industries versus well-established industries? And Bailey had mentioned tax codes really vary by state, and it makes a big difference. So in Wyoming, we don't have corporate income taxes, which is one reason why we're getting a lot of companies interested in coming here. But that doesn't mean there's not other taxes sort of affecting things. And even those downstream effects matter. Like, we have a lot of oil and gas production. So interestingly, those sort of knock-on effects would cause severance taxes if they're using natural gas, which again, then you have to look at what's their energy source and how does that interplay with your particular local economy. Now, this will matter differently for your project. In our case, we had a company come to us and want to do an economic impact study, and in their scenario, where they're purchasing things is going to be kind of binary. Did they make these large purchases in state or out of state? Unlike some industries you might see where things are a little more diffuse, they might be buying $1 billion worth of capital in pre-purchase turbines, as an example, or maybe their battery system. And whether your state provides them or not can make a big difference if it's 100% or zero in your particular case. If you're doing sort of an industry average, I think it's already kind of captured in some of the models. What are we seeing as a trade flow? So being aware that in your particular case, there might be sort of a yes or no answer for is it coming from in-state or out-of-state or whatever your region of interest is, and just thinking through those issues. So not all of these applied in our study, but some of them did, and we'll go through those. But just think about that when you're building your model of, am I capturing some of these complexities that come with a large, fast-growing, and changing industry. So I mentioned we kind of are building a sort of toy model but it's based on some of our experience. Particularly, we had a economic impact study question come in, and they want us to say, hey, how over time are we going to affect the local economy in Wyoming? And this can be used for a lot of use cases. We always make sure to try to present benefits and costs, but it really helps them to go to business councils. I've, in a different project, had some local governments say that people called and were concerned about different issues. So you might be able to kind of garner some public support by saying, hey, I know you're concerned about these costs, but let's look at our benefits too. And kind of give people some planning expectations. I love that RIMI has some population and economic migrant type models. That's really valuable, particularly in Wyoming, because we have such small states that housing can be a big constraint. And in our case, there's some overlap with large industrial projects that are also bringing data centers, so you already have sort of strained housing constraints. So this is some good use cases, I think, that it sort of comes from. Okay, so in this generalized model, because we have an NDA with that particular project, I used it to inform sort of a toy model that is feasible, ratios of capital and labor and things from what we've experienced, but isn't using the same numbers. We selected Lincoln County, Wyoming. One reason for that is there's been some news articles, because that's where TerraPower is building a nuclear reactor that some companies want to contract to use that power. Now, they wouldn't have to center there because you could contract the power in other places, but data centers, when they are getting really high returns on operating, do not want to shut down. So being located near a stable energy source is an advantage. So worth considering what those impacts might be. We selected a $5 billion overall capital investment in the three components of the project: the actual data center, natural gas power, and battery storage. These are different components we've seen, and we want to kind of lay out all of them. In your case, you might just be doing a data center, which is a little different, but I think it will come up a lot if you're looking at a particular impact that you're going to need to model some of their tertiary infrastructure. And we sort of divided it up just for discussion as the construction period and operating period. There's some overlap in when they're operating and during the construction, but we're sort of projecting, hey, they're going to come online next year, and let's see how RIMI, with its sort of long run coefficients, forecast this out into the future. So in our model, we selected 8 different parameters. Again, there's a few powerful ways RIMI can model this, then it might be different in your scenario. So we had 3 types of impacts we ended up putting in. The first one was detailed investment. And so when we look at this capital expenditure, and it's quite large, especially in a small state like Wyoming, these leakages can matter a lot. So we really didn't want to look at, okay, we don't want to model that as an output. We want to be a little bit more conservative. And one way we were conservative with that is saying, you're purchasing a natural gas turbine, you're purchasing these batteries. We need you to say where you're purchasing it from and not just sort of assume it's coming locally. And that was one of the great things we got with RIMI, where we could see, yeah, there's these large investments and where they're coming from. We don't, our study was focused on the state, but it would also be quite interesting that you're going to have some larger effects throughout the nation when you're looking at these because of this trading. So we modeled purchasing on the computers, which is a major expense. Another thing that you should keep in mind and look at sort of your project averages, as it will vary, is how often you're replacing computers. We assume there'd sort of be a capital refresh about every 5 years. So we sort of bake that into our model when we do our inputs. But there's going to be purchases of computer and peripheries. Some of the electrical equipment sort of models are repurchasing those batteries, and then engines and turbines. So we looked at these detailed investment events as a separate category from output. Next, the one area we did have some output is construction is a pretty well-established field. We, based on some averages and what data were provided, have an idea of how much is going to go into actually building like the building. So that's an area where I felt very comfortable of using the local model to sort of create employment effects locally. So for the construction of the actual building, once we've sort of divided up our average cost, we do that as an output event. And one thing to think about is we used some reports because things were still in the planning phase in our project. So we had to analyze that. We relied on some industry averages of capital and employment splits, but if you have those numbers pinned down, that can be really good to put in. And then the next area we did was employment. Because it was in the planning phase, we felt a little more confident in predicting some of the employment in these areas. And since there's a few phases in our project, we had both our sort of operating the power plant type employment and the industry employment for the data centers. So using the data operations category for that employment, we did some sort of averaging forecast. And that's kind of roughly what we're showing here. We did a more detailed regression analysis for our actual model, but as one example, this is sort of a log linear fit where we did a log on the left side of employment based on the capacity side of power plants. So because we had such a large model, $5 billion investment, you don't want to over project the employment by doing sort of a linear fit. So we felt it was the most conservative way to model our outputs by looking at employment and doing this sort of log linear forecasting based on our capacity. So that's one reason we did that. If anything, it'll underestimate the total economic impact, but we want to be very conservative when we're doing these planning forecasts. So. And then Bailey did a lot of work on the tax side, so I'll turn it over to him.
Yeah, just super briefly. Of course, we talked about fiscal revenue being one of the large benefits generated by these data centers. And so we wanted to model that explicitly. We utilized RIMI's tax PI model, which is a state level model. And what you essentially do is you calibrate a state revenue budget model where you input line items for revenue and line items for expenditures. These line items could include things like sales and use taxes, property taxes, federal mineral royalties, in our case, severance taxes, and various investment income sources. We worked with the Wyoming Economic Analysis Division, who's a state entity, does a lot of what it sounds like economic analysis here in the state. They do a lot of revenue forecasting. And so we worked with them to detail these line items and then to work through how to connect them into our model. And in RIMI, you establish a policy and indicator variables that essentially say, when some model outcome changes, this is how it influences your revenue line item. And when that revenue line item changes, this is how it affects government spending and feeds back into the general equilibrium model. So we calibrated all of that. And then we took into account those sales tax exemptions that I mentioned previously on computing, power generation, battery, and air filtration equipment by adjusting the proportion of output, data center industry output, that's tax exempt, using some RIMI provided data on intermediate inputs to production for your average data center. And then lastly, as Alex mentioned before, it's important to think about where these inputs come from in calculating your fiscal revenue as well. In Wyoming, we don't double tax inputs to production. So if there's a 4%, say, sales tax from whatever state you bought your computing equipment from, Wyoming's going to levy an additional 2% on top of that to hit our county and statewide average of about 6% effective taxes. And so just some things to consider along the way. That's all going to be very context specific. So you'll have to think through how that policy fits your specific scenario.
Thanks. So turning to the results, kind of get some idea of how this sort of explains the industry and some of the things we got out of our RIMI model. This broke out our employment effects over our course of a period, and we see a large growth in employment early on during the construction, which makes a lot of sense. and that tapers out. And I really like that the sort of this long-term projection of how those spillover effects might happen with spending and as efficiency changes. We sort of limited our direct effects to be constant based on some of our assumptions, but that might be different for different use cases. And another thing to highlight is, especially for us, and your region is going to vary, the construction period was really important for these induced effects. That it's important to do these modeling because it's not just count up the jobs, which might be kind of small for the total economic output, but a lot of that spending, especially when people are doing construction and bringing a lot of money into the area, can be quite significant for economic impacts. Another thing to highlight that I really like is you can break down what types of jobs are being affected. Sometimes economists, we kind of aggregate everything into one, utility function or something like that. But, it matters who's getting these jobs for the people who already exist, and they want to know that breakout. And there's pretty major changes across these time periods that the machinery manufacturing is all happening sort of prior to the operating period because they need to have the machines to operate. So those sort of effects are more top heavy, whereas the operating expenditure and energy production is a little more heavy on the operating end. So seeing that the ratio of jobs can change over time, I think is a powerful tool that we have with RIMI when we talk with our clients. So, and then GDP is obviously another area to talk about. We don't highlight all of the different economic indicators here, but we're happy to follow up if there's any other questions about other ones. But so we see a similar trend in production, except as the industry is growing, we're getting a little more GDP growth with that efficiency gain. I also broke up sort of our local effects in our test county of Lincoln versus the rest of the state. And I wanted to highlight that looks small, but it's actually quite important when you look at the individual level, that looking at where this trade and flow is coming, there's different, our state has very specific industries in different regions. There's some manufacturing up north. There's a university here down in the southeast. So there are different sort of diverse areas where you might be getting different impacts. And there's multi-millions of dollars of impacts in other state, even though we're mostly getting in our local counties. So I think when talking to the state overall, it's important to say, hey, yeah, there are concentrated benefits, but it's not that the rest of the state doesn't have other impacts. So with that, that's kind of the main focus of the talk, but I'm happy to take any questions, and I appreciate everyone's time.
Awesome. Thank you so much to Alex and Bailey for the awesome presentation. And thank you to all who have attended and asked questions so far. I want to remind everyone that we'll shortly be getting into the Q&A portion of this presentation. So if you haven't asked any questions yet, or if you have additional questions, please enter those now, and we should have time to get to it. But if for some reason we're not able to, we will reach out to you. We will also be sharing these slides and the recording from this webinar to you through email, so keep your eye out for that. And if you have any questions, once you have the time to review those a bit closer, please reach out to the emails on the screen to reach out to our presenters. Awesome. So now we have some questions. There also are some coming in, so feel free to ask away. The first question we've received is, did you do any analysis to compare the increase in tax revenue to the state incentive expenditure? When does the state break even?
So, I mean, yes and no. We did a counterfactual where we said, how much money would you bring in if you didn't have these tax incentives? So, and that was easy enough to model. We kind of took away some of the tax write-offs in the RIMI model, and we also had some direct effects we had to calculate by hand. RIMI was very useful, especially in those sort of spillover and county effects where we couldn't calculate it directly. But so we did say this is what it'd be if the project came here and you didn't have those tax incentives. What we didn't do, which you could certainly model and be an interesting question just because it was outside of our scope, was would you have come here without that? So that's part of the question is, are these tax incentives actually what's bringing it versus not? But let's say yes, it was simple enough to run the model with and without some of the tax incentives. Just is that counterfactual true that the data center would come anyway?
Awesome, thank you. Another question we received is there any thought in Wyoming being given to taxing data centers through other methods than just sales tax, property tax, and income tax?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Is there any thought in Wyoming being given to taxing data centers through ulterior methods than just the traditional sales tax, property tax, and income tax?
Have you run across anything, Bailey? I haven't.
No, I'm not totally sure. That's certainly something we can look into. And this policy space is changing pretty rapidly, and it can be a little bit tricky to keep up with exactly what's being debated at the moment. But yeah, if we'll look into it and try to get you some answers, see if we can find any other sources. But in our experience, sort of the predominant policy was centered around those sales tax exemptions.
Yeah, and I'd say I'd be a little, I mean, there are obviously diversity of opinions in the legislature about these issues, but so far the dominant area has been increasing tax exemptions. So I'd be a little surprised if there are other ones. We looked at, and it ended up being redundant with some of our other tax policy. The state has like a zoning tax exemption law where they're saying, hey, if you're bringing enough money, if you're in these special zones, we'll try to exempt more taxes. It was redundant with some of the other data center ones when they're large enough, but it would kind of be going in the opposite direction to start adding new taxes. But your state is going to be different. You know, one reason why it's hard to talk about this growing industry that has such different opinions depending on what state you're in. We're really focusing on diversifying our economic profile. So I think Wyoming particularly is really interested in bringing them in, where a state with more diversity in the economy might be less so.
Awesome, thank you. Did you consider new energy, just like Bloom Energy on site of data centers, to be more efficient and environmentally friendly?
We didn't, just because it was a particular use case. That's something I'm interested in sort of my broader research and working on, but I don't think I could talk about it immediately. So there's been some news articles talking about, and there's definitely been interest in things like adding nuclear on site. And you should always be aware that's going to have different incentives, because from the data center's perspective, they like the consistency, but now you're not even bringing in that sort of indirect effect into the gas sector. It's going to be in uranium. So how efficiency changes over time is going to matter, and what energy source. But in our particular study, we didn't change the energy source from gas.
Awesome, thank you. What are the anticipated long-term impacts to local governments, such as on roads, education systems, law enforcement, and other services?
So I'll say RIMI does a great, and maybe some of the RIMI guys could talk about the different options you have. There are a lot of models that let you sort of look at some of those impact. There's, of course, employment is something we've sort of played with, and some of those externalities, but it wasn't a focus of our study, so we don't necessarily have a prediction of that, just because of what we were asked to do. But I think, to be honest, well, if you're looking at a particular data center, I don't think it's super large, that once it's in operation, there's only going to be 100 or 2 employees. So I wouldn't expect major sort of externalities from that sort of impact. But where we have seen it has been quite relevant in Wyoming is the spike in the construction period. That was especially relevant in our case area of Lincoln County, because they're also building the nuclear power plant. And now you have multiple projects going on time in a very small, like 2,000 population city. So probably depends on how much flexibility your particular infrastructure has. But I don't know if there's anything you want to highlight with those sort of impacts in RIMI.
David or Jeff, do you have any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, I would say so. Because REMI makes custom models. First and foremost, the geography is the most important part once you start approaching and attacking questions like this. So the outputs that you get using a REMI model are extensive. So certainly you could see impacts on law enforcement, roads, and infrastructure investments. I think for this particular project, the model wasn't built to capture those geographies, but the model is such custom built that you know, depending on the scope of the particular project or the question that you're getting after, that just depends on the build of the economic model itself. Because again, the geography that you built with is the foundation, and that is the economy that you're looking at to start.
Yeah, I think I mentioned it before. One thing I'd highlight before we move on is I think you can find some of those effects by looking at sort of these economic migrant impacts, which I really love that RIMI gives you, because that does show you how much strain you're going to have on your infrastructure and how many police you might need to add and things like that. So I love that that's an option on the model, because seeing how many new people are coming versus sort of natural population growth, I think can be important in those sort of cases.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, the nature of the model is dynamic, so we have to bring into the equation the fact that people will respond to a changing economy. So you're going to see economic migrants moving in due to the dynamic nature of things. That's right. Great point, Alex.
And I think there's a lot of flexibility on the tax side as well, to connect revenue line items to expenditure line items. If you want to get into the weeds at creating an incredibly detailed government budget, and you could sit there and say, hey, increases in tax revenue from sales taxes from data centers is earmarked for policing activity or something like that. You feasibly could in the RIMI model. Some of that is very tough to do at scale. It can be really, really tricky capturing a lot of the nuance, but it's certainly possible in that way too.
Great. Thank you for your thoughts, everybody. Thank you also to everyone who's asked questions. There's still more coming, so keep them coming. We got time. Another question we received is, for the permanent data center jobs, was there any consideration for a proportion of workers that would actually live and work in the county versus people teleworking from other areas or states?
So because we're looking at the general region, we relied on sort of the RIMI coefficients for local or not. But I've looked at that in some other studies. It's for us, it was pretty safe to say that they're pretty much all local. In some of our case studies, well, I gotta think about what I can say. It depends on which county in Wyoming you're looking at. In Cheyenne, there might be more commuting because there's a little more connection to Fort Collins. In some of these rural counties, like we've been studying, it's 95% of people live in the same county type of thing. So, yeah, we considered it. In our case, it wasn't something we needed to add complexity in the model beyond what RIMI is automatically doing for us.
Great, thank you. Another question received is, can you explain more about operational employment?
Sure. I mean, if there's a more specific question, let me know if I don't tackle it, because that could be broad. It's for the total output, there's not necessarily a large number of jobs, maybe up to 200 people or so. It's going to be people who do infrastructure repairs, upgrade the servers, IT maintenance, that sort of thing. So a lot in sort of the tech fields where you're going to sort of keep the gears running, but a handful of like maintenance and construction work that would need to come in every once in a while. So there's also a good amount of contracting work. Sometimes you'll contract out, like maybe you're not constantly resetting up your network administration systems, but you hire a contractor to come in and sort of evaluate your efficiencies and do some repairs. So some long-term and then some kind of intermediate long-term where sort of between all the data centers, maybe the contractor is bouncing around to do the work, but he's not hired by a particular data center.
Great, thank you. Another question received is, were there any surprising results in your analysis?
Yeah, I mean, my biggest surprise was looking at the sort of those long-term trends, and they kind of made sense once I broke them down, but seeing that because there are efficiency gains, we do kind of expect larger GDP growth with time, but maybe a little less employment. So I really like that RIMI could bring in some reasonable assumptions about those long-term effects. And things are going to change. You know, it's harder to forecast in 50 years, but I'd say the sort of long-term convergence was the most interesting to me that I wasn't necessarily expecting. I thought it would be a little flatter than it was.
Awesome. It appears the economic impact, for example, GDP, drops off significantly, possibly back down to pre-data center levels after a short period of time. Is that a concern?
Well, I'm as a as an analyst, I'm not concerned either way. In a way, I just want to give the best information. So, I mean, that's the sidestepping answer. But I think for a policymaker, and I emphasize this in some of our reports when we write to people, looking how you're evaluating over time is important. So it is a benefit to have a lot of upfront. In fact, we kind of sometimes discount long term because you can reinvest that money. So I think it really depends on your perspective. If your area is concerned about these booms and busts, which we're quite used to in Wyoming, being an energy state, um, it could be more of a concern than if you are finding those benefits useful up front. Certainly, you can reinvest that money that you get in the construction period into parks and housing or different things, and it can provide long-term benefits. But I think that's more of a planning and policy question. You could do it in a way where you see those benefits long term, or it could kind of be a little bit spiky. I will say it doesn't really go down to pre-data center levels. It's certainly we found a lot more upfront benefits in the construction. And you should also think about, because we are focusing on Wyoming, we have a lot of leakages out of our state. Sometimes we get pushback of like, we expected higher multipliers. And it's like, yeah, but we don't produce computers in the state. So you're not going to get that here. So if you're looking at a different state, maybe you'd see less of a drop off. But whether you're concerned, I think is, well, I guess you definitely should consider it in your policy analysis, and how much of a concern maybe is more a question for a policymaker.
Awesome, thank you. Another question received is, how do these results compare in a dynamic model versus a static model?
I'm not sure I have that answer ready, but I'm happy to get back if you want to follow up and ask specifics. I mean, in a static model, you're not going to see those long-term trends, which I found useful when discussing the results. Like if you're just doing a pure input-output model without doing any of the cool dynamic models Rumi's doing, you don't see how you get that GDP growth with time and changing in employment. So that'd be my best stab at it, but I haven't done a direct comparison. So I could get back to you that if that doesn't answer the question.
Great, thank you, Alex. Another question we received is, are the bulk of property taxes from the assessed value of the equipment inside the data center, in particular the chips or the structures?
Let me think. I think it's pretty close to the even split, but I would have to, I'll follow up and I can maybe give you, I can't give exact, but I could give you the rough. It might be like 60-40 split or something like that. There's a lot goes into the computers. And some of those also give you more sales tax because they get replaced. So the building, the physical building is important, but not as large as some of the other computers and power generation. Oh, I guess that plays into it too, is also in our scenario, we're looking at the batteries and the turbines are there. So that's kind of giving you some property tax you might not get if you're just looking at the data center. If you're just looking at the data center, I'm pretty sure it's going to be pretty heavy on some of those computer equipment. But we have a little bit more sort of infrastructure investment in our test model.
Thank you, Alex. Another question received is, what version of REMI is being used in this analysis?
Oh, it's the most recent one, but you'd have to, I forget the version number we're on. I don't know if anyone knows. But we're using PI Plus and Tax PI as two separate ways of integrating our model. So if that also helps, but I don't remember what version number we're on.
Yeah, I think that's probably what they were referring to. Yeah. So yeah, the PI Plus and the Tax PI.
Okay. Yeah, we're using PI Plus and Tax PI in conjunction with each other. And they have different advantages. Of the Tax PI is, of course, giving us some of those really strong controls over our taxing, which is important because we have such a unique tax system. So, but the PI Plus, we were able to get more regional data that I highlighted. So they both had some pros for us, different use cases.
Also, and one last question as we reach the 3 o'clock here is, have the data centers needed to obtain water rights for cooling? And if so, how does that impact local jurisdictions and farmers or ranchers?
I've done separately a lot of research in ranchers and farming water rights. Typically, they're going to have, I mean, I don't get too far into water rights. The farmers and ranchers will typically have priority right because it's based on when you first utilize the water. And this is off of memory, so don't necessarily quote me. I think Cheyenne said they're using about 1.2% of their total water that's allocated for city use. So it does depend on the use case. I don't think they had problems getting it. They were able to purchase it without having constraint. But of course, depending on where you are, you might have to come against those constraints, and they might not select that site or redesign their system to use a little less water intensive. So there's some flexibility in that.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Alex and Bailey, for your excellent presentation. Those are all the questions we've received so far. I do again encourage everyone, if there's anything that comes up after this concludes, please reach out to the emails on the screen here to have your questions answered. Also want to remind everyone that we'll be sharing these slides and recording to you shortly, so keep your eye out for that through your email. But yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. And again, thank you, Alex and Bailey, for the excellent presentation. And we hope you will
Thank you
attend.
for the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. We hope you'll join more REMI webinars in the future.
Sure.
Bye, everyone.